January 20th, 1944, 1900 hours. Rapido River, Italy. Private Jim White of the Texas 36th Division crouched at the river's edge, watching rubber boats capsize in the current as German MG-42 machine guns, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, ripped through his battalion. The engineers who were supposed to build footbridges lay dead in the minefield behind him. The boats that survived the crossing were splintering under direct hits from German mortars, pre-registered, to cover every meter of the riverbank. White carried an M1 carbine slung across his shoulders and a 60mm mortar tube strapped to his back, together weighing nearly 40 pounds before ammunition. He'd been ordered across a 50-foot wide torrent running at 8 miles per hour toward bunkers he couldn't see, defended by troops who'd had 4 months to prepare positions, while his division had been in continuous combat since September. The Rapido was 9 feet deep. The current pulled heavily laden men straight to the bottom. The east bank was a swamp deliberately flooded by German engineers, diverting irrigation channels. The west bank was a cliff 3 feet above water level, impossible to scale under fire. And looming over everything, 1,706 feet above sea level, the monastery of Monte Cassino, where German observers could see every move, called down artillery fire with coordinates accurate to 10 meters. What happened in the next 48 hours would become one of the US Army's worst disasters of World War II. But the Rapido crossing was just the beginning of a 4-month battle that would consume 105,000 Allied casualties and test every tactical and technological innovation of modern warfare, from strategic bombing to combined arms assaults to night infiltration tactics perfected in brutal mountain combat. This is the story of the Winter Line, Germany's impregnable defensive barrier across Italy. It's about the forgotten multinational army that broke it. Texas farmers, Polish exiles from Soviet gulags, French colonial troops from Morocco and Algeria, New Zealand Maori warriors, Indian Gurkhas, British infantry, and Canadian tankers. It's about how fortifications, terrain, and tactical brilliance created a killing ground where courage alone was insufficient, where technology and doctrine collided with geography and determination, and where the forgotten heroes of Monte Cassino wrote one of World War II's most brutal chapters. To understand what happened at Monte Cassino, you must first understand what the Germans had created. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, had spent 4 months constructing 3 defensive lines across the Italian peninsula: the Barbara Line, Bernhard Line, and the Gustav Line. Together they formed the Winter Line, 100 miles of fortifications spanning from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, designed to stop the Allied advance toward Rome. The Gustav Line's anchor was Monte Cassino, not because of the monastery itself, but because of geography. The mountain completely dominated Highway 6, the only practical route to Rome. The Liri Valley, which the highway traversed, was flanked by mountains too rugged for armor. Any army advancing to Rome would have to pass through that valley, and any army in that valley could be observed and destroyed from Monte Cassino's heights. German engineers had turned the entire region into an integrated killing ground. The 1st Parachute Division, Fallschirmjäger, elite troops with their own specialized equipment and doctrine, held the key positions. These weren't ordinary infantry. They wore distinctive splinter-pattern camouflage jump smocks, carried MP-40 submachine guns and the deadly MG-42, and had been fighting continuously since 1940 in Crete, North Africa, and Russia. The defensive positions they'd built were masterworks of military engineering: reinforced concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, machine gun positions set into solid rock, mortar pits with pre-calculated firing data for every approach, barbed wire barriers in depth, minefields marked and registered on maps so German troops could cross safely while attackers died, observation posts linked by telephone lines buried 6 feet deep where artillery couldn't sever them. The town of Cassino itself had been fortified building by building. The Continental Hotel became a fortress. Thick masonry walls turned every room into a bunker, with firing ports cut through at ground level. German engineers had reinforced basements to serve as bomb-proof shelters. Anti-tank guns covered every street intersection. The entire town was an interlocking system of strongpoints where a company could hold against a battalion. And above it all, the monastery, its thick walls visible for miles, its position making it the most conspicuous terrain feature in Italy. Whether Germans occupied it or not, they initially did not. Its presence dominated Allied planning and German tactics. Major General Fred Walker, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, knew the Rapido crossing was doomed before it began. His division had been in combat since landing at Salerno in September 1943. They'd fought at Altavilla, where Corporal Charles Kelly earned America's first European Medal of Honor throwing mortar shells from a balcony. They'd bled at San Pietro, taking 2,400 casualties, assaulting prepared German positions in mountain terrain. They were understrength by 500 men per regiment, filled with green replacements who'd arrived just days before the attack. The tactical situation was impossible. The Rapido, though small, was swift and deep. Both banks were under German observation from Monte Cassino to Sant'Ambrogio. The British X-Corps, supposed to secure the left flank by seizing high ground, had been stopped cold. The French Expeditionary Corps, attacking in the mountains to the north, had made minimal progress. The 36th would cross with both flanks exposed, attacking the best defended sector of the entire Gustav Line. Walker had proposed crossing north of Monte Cassino, where the river was fordable and German defences weaker. General Mark Clark, 5th Army commander, insisted on the planned crossing site. Clark was convinced a breakthrough here would allow armour to exploit into the Liri Valley toward Rome. He'd ordered Major General Ernest Harman's 1st Armoured Division to prepare for immediate exploitation, tanks that would roll to Rome as soon as engineers bridged the river. Impossible, Harman had told Clark. The general either couldn't or wouldn't see what Walker saw clearly. This attack would fail. On January 20th at 1900 hours, after a preparatory bombardment of 31,000 artillery rounds that achieved negligible damage against dug-in positions, the 141st and 143rd Infantry Regiments began crossing. The problems started immediately. Engineers tasked with clearing mines hit German S-mines, bouncing betties that leaped to waist height before detonating, shredding anyone within 20 meters. The mine-clearing parties took casualties before reaching the river. Paths marked with white tape were moved by German infiltrators, channeling Americans into uncleared minefields. The assault boats, rubber craft requiring 8 men to paddle, were left 2 miles behind the lines because German artillery prevented vehicles from approaching. Infantry already carrying 40 to 60 pounds of equipment had to hand-carry boats weighing 65 pounds through the muddy approaches, across minefields, under mortar fire. Those who reached the river discovered the current was too strong for rubber boats. Craft capsized midstream. Others were swept downstream into German positions. German gunners had pre-registered every crossing point. MG-42's Hitler's buzzsaw opened fire with cyclic rates exceeding 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was terrifying, not the rattle of American 30-caliber machine guns, but a high-pitched tearing roar like ripping canvas. 2 companies of the 143rd made it across, establishing small footholds on the west bank. But without bridges, they couldn't be reinforced or supplied. Engineers attempting to construct footbridges came under such intense fire that the work was impossible. By dawn on January 21st, both regiments had been forced to withdraw or had been destroyed trying. The 141st attempted a second crossing that night. The 2nd and 3rd battalions managed to cross, finding no sign of the 1st Battalion's survivors. They'd been overrun. Engineers worked frantically to complete bridges, but after dawn, the accurate German fire made continued work suicidal. The footbridges were destroyed. 2 battalions were trapped 600 yards from the river with no supply, no reinforcements, no evacuation for wounded. By evening of January 22nd, organized resistance collapsed. Officers tried to organize breakouts. Some men attempted to swim back. Jim White watched a soldier tie a rope around himself and try to cross, only to be pulled under by the current. 40 men from the 141st made it back alive. The butcher's bill was catastrophic: 143 killed, 663 wounded, 875 missing, 2,877 casualties total. The division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Germans lost 64 killed, 179 wounded. They hadn't even needed to commit reserves. In 1946, veterans petitioned Congress to investigate. They called it one of the most colossal blunders of the Second World War. They wanted General Mark Clark court-martialed. The investigation concluded the attack was necessary, and Clark had exercised sound judgment. The survivors never forgave that conclusion, never forgot their dead friends left on the far bank. The Rapido crossing proved what German commanders already knew. Frontal assaults against prepared Gustav Line positions were suicide. Breaking the winter line would require something different. While Americans died crossing the Rapido, General Alphonse Juin's French Expeditionary Corps was demonstrating that there was another way to fight in Italian mountains. Juin commanded a force unlike any other in the Allied armies. 4 divisions totaling 112,000 men, primarily colonial troops from French North Africa, Moroccans, Algerians, Tunisians, led by French officers. These weren't garrison troops. They were mountain fighters from the Atlas Mountains and Rif, men who'd grown up in terrain as harsh as the Italian Apennines, who understood mountain warfare intuitively. The French corps included specialized mountain units, the Goumiers, Moroccan irregulars organized in tabors, wearing distinctive striped djellabas and carrying a mix of modern weapons and traditional knives. They moved through mountains at night, infiltrating German positions silently, attacking with knives and grenades before fading back into darkness. Juin's tactical doctrine rejected frontal assaults. Instead, French units would probe German lines continuously, identifying weak points, infiltrating at night, seizing positions that dominated surrounding terrain. They fought with limited artillery support. Mountain warfare required infantry skill more than firepower. German positions that appeared impregnable from the valley floor could be approached from ridges and ravines where defenders couldn't observe or fire effectively. On January 12, 1944, the French began their offensive north of Cassino, attacking through the Monte Cairo Massif, terrain the Germans considered impassable for military operations. French colonial troops, many wearing American-supplied M1943 field jackets over traditional North African clothing, carrying M1 Garand rifles and Thompson submachine guns, moved through mountains in winter conditions that would have stopped conventional units. The Goumiers proved particularly effective. Operating in small groups, they infiltrated German lines at night, seized positions, held them against counterattacks until regular infantry arrived. German defenders, accustomed to predictable Allied tactics, found themselves outflanked repeatedly by troops appearing from impassable terrain. By late January, French forces had penetrated deep into the mountains, threatening to outflank the entire Gustav Line. But the advance stalled due to weather, supply difficulties, and mounting casualties. The French had proven mountain positions could be taken, but at terrible cost and with specialized troops most Allied armies didn't possess. The lesson wasn't lost on German commanders. If mountains could be penetrated by skilled infiltrators, every defensive position needed depth, reserves, and troops capable of counterattacking infiltrations before they could be exploited. By February 1944, Allied commanders faced a decision that would haunt them for decades. Should they bomb the Monte Cassino monastery? The Benedictine Abbey, founded in 529 AD by Saint Benedict, was one of Christianity's most sacred sites. It housed priceless manuscripts, religious art, and the bones of the order's founder. The Germans had publicly promised not to occupy it, declaring it a neutral zone. But Allied troops staring up at the monastery from positions in the valley were convinced Germans occupied it. Reports came from soldiers who claimed to see German troops on the walls, radio antennas, observation posts. The monastery's position, dominating every approach, seemed perfect for artillery observers. How could the Germans not be using it? Intelligence assessments were contradictory. Some analysts concluded Germans occupied it, others found no evidence. The truth was complex. The Germans had initially honored their promise, but they'd fortified positions into the slopes below the walls, creating defensive positions so close to the monastery that the distinction barely mattered tactically. General Harold Alexander, commanding 15th Army Group, authorized bombing. His logic was pragmatic. Even if Germans didn't occupy it now, they'd certainly use the ruins as a strongpoint once Allied troops reached the summit. The abbey's destruction would eliminate both a German advantage and Allied soldiers' fixation on it as a symbol. On February 15, 1944, Operation Avenger commenced. At 09:45 hours, 142 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers appeared over Monte Cassino. Each B-17 carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, a mix of high explosive and incendiaries. They were followed by 47 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and 40 B-26 Marauder medium bombers. The bombardment was overwhelming. In total, 1,150 tons of explosives struck the monastery. The ancient structure, walls 6 feet thick, built to last centuries, crumbled under the onslaught. The entire summit disappeared in smoke, flame, and pulverized stone. Between bombing runs, Allied artillery pounded the mountain with thousands of additional shells. Many Allied soldiers cheered, watching the hated symbol of their frustration destroyed. But some understood immediately that a terrible mistake had been made. General Juin reportedly remarked, "No, they'll never get anywhere this way." He was right. The bombing killed 230 Italian civilians who had sheltered in the monastery, believing it a safe zone. It killed no German soldiers because none were inside. But once the ruins cooled, German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers moved in, establishing positions among rubble that provided better cover than the intact structure ever had. The shattered monastery became a fortress. Concrete bunkers were built into collapsed walls. Machine gun nests occupied former prayer chambers. The rubble created countless firing positions with clear fields of fire down every approach. What had been a protected cultural site became what Germans had promised it wouldn't be, their strongest defensive position. The infantry assault following the bombardment failed catastrophically. Routes to the summit were blocked by rubble and craters. German defenders, now occupying the ruins, repelled every attack with minimal casualties. The monastery's destruction achieved nothing except creating a better defensive position for the Germans and providing them with a propaganda victory. The Allies had destroyed a sacred site, killing civilians for no military gain. The failure of the February offensive forced Allied commanders to reconsider their entire approach. The 2mm Tunnel Judichide, the New Zealand Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, took over the Cassino sector in mid-February. Freyberg was a veteran of World War I, holder of the Victoria Cross, commander of forces that had fought across the Middle East and Mediterranean. He understood combined arms warfare and believed properly applied firepower could destroy any defense. His plan for the second assault, conducted March 15-23, 1944, represented the most concentrated application of firepower yet attempted against a single target. The town of Cassino would be obliterated by strategic bombing, then assaulted by infantry supported by armor. The New Zealand 2nd Division would attack the town while the 4th Indian Division assaulted Castle Hill and Hangman's Hill, key terrain features overlooking the monastery. The bombing, Operation Dickens, commenced at 08:30 hours on March 15th. Over 500 aircraft, heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers struck Cassino in waves. They dropped 1,400 tons of bombs in just 3 hours, more explosive power than had been dropped on any target in Italy. The town ceased to exist as a recognizable urban landscape. Buildings collapsed into rubble, streets disappeared under craters and debris. The Continental Hotel, the German strongpoint, was buried under tons of masonry. Surely nothing could survive such devastation. But when New Zealand infantry advanced, supported by Sherman tanks of the 20th Armored Regiment, they discovered the bombing had created worse problems than it solved. The rubble blocked every street. Tanks attempting to maneuver through the debris bogged down, presented their thin side armor to German anti-tank guns, and were destroyed. The German PaK-40 75mm anti-tank gun, hidden in basement positions, could penetrate a Sherman's 50mm side armor at 1,000 meters. Sherman's burning in Cassino streets became landmarks turned left at the second burning tank. German defenders hadn't been destroyed, they'd been sheltered in basement bunkers that survived the bombing. As New Zealand infantry tried to advance through rubble, German troops emerged from underground positions, established firing positions in the debris, and stopped the attack cold. The battle devolved into house-to-house fighting in ruins. Small units, platoon or even squad strength, would fight for days to clear a single building. German Fallschirmjäger, trained in close combat, excelled in this environment. They'd established defensive positions in depth, with fallback positions prepared so that cleared buildings could be reoccupied at night. The 4th Indian Division's assault on Castle Hill demonstrated similar problems. Indian troops, Gurkhas from Nepal, Rajputana rifles, Maratha light infantry, were among the British Empire's finest soldiers. They'd fought across East Africa, North Africa, and Italy, but attacking fortified mountain positions required more than skill.
Castle Hill and Hangman's Hill were so steep that troops climbed on hands and knees. They carried their weapons, ammunition for an extended fight, 200 rounds per rifle, more for machine guns, grenades, and rations up slopes where footing was treacherous. German positions on the heights had clear fields of fire down every approach. Attackers were silhouetted against skylines, visible to defenders in concealed positions. The Gurkhas reached their objectives through extraordinary courage, accepting appalling casualties. But they couldn't be supplied or reinforced. Carrying ammunition up those slopes under fire was impossible. They held their positions for days, then were forced to withdraw when ammunition ran out. By March 23rd, the second battle ended in stalemate. The town remained contested, the heights remained in German hands, Allied casualties exceeded 2,000. The Germans had again demonstrated that prepared defensive positions, skillfully defended, could survive even overwhelming firepower and determined assault. The battles for Cassino have often been portrayed as primarily American and British efforts, but the forces assembled for the final assault in May 1944 represented one of history's most diverse coalitions. The Polish II Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders, numbered approximately 50,000 troops, survivors of Soviet deportations to Siberian gulags. Released after Germany invaded Russia, evacuated through Persia to British-controlled territories. They'd traveled from Poland to Soviet labor camps, to Iran, to Palestine, to Iraq, to Egypt, to Italy, an odyssey of suffering that had forged them into soldiers with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Their equipment was British: Lee Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, 25-pounder field guns. But their motivation was uniquely Polish. Many had families still in Soviet-occupied eastern Poland. All had witnessed firsthand both Nazi and Soviet atrocities. Fighting Germans in Italy was the only way to contribute to Poland's eventual liberation. The Polish Corps included the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division and the 5th Kresowa Infantry Division. The Carpathians had fought at Tobruk. The Kresowa Division was newly formed from troops evacuated from the Soviet Union. Both were supplemented by support units, armour, and the 12th Podolian Lancers, a reconnaissance regiment that would play a crucial role in the final assault. The French Expeditionary Corps, now 4 divisions strong, remained the mountain warfare specialists. General Jouen had refined his infiltration tactics through bitter experience. His troops knew how to move through mountains at night, how to identify weak points in defences, how to exploit successfully infiltrations before Germans could counterattack. The Indian Army contributed multiple divisions, including the battle-hardened 4th and 8th. These weren't colonial levies, they were professional soldiers from martial traditions centuries old. Gurkha battalions carried their traditional kukri knives alongside Lee Enfield rifles. Sikhs, Punjabis, Marathas, Rajputs. Each unit brought distinct tactical traditions adapted to modern warfare. British divisions included the 78th Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily. Canadian units brought Sherman tanks and expertise in armoured operations. New Zealand troops, though battered by previous assaults, remained in line. This multinational force faced problems beyond combat effectiveness. Language barriers complicated coordination. Different armies had different equipment, different tactics, different logistical systems. A British artillery observer attached to Polish infantry had to translate fire missions through an interpreter. French units using American equipment required separate supply chains from British units using Commonwealth equipment. Yet this diversity also provided advantages. French mountain tactics worked where conventional approaches failed. Polish motivation exceeded any units the Germans had faced. Indian Army experience in mountain and jungle warfare brought techniques invaluable in Italian terrain. The coalition's combined capabilities exceeded any single national army. General Harold Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group, spent April 1944 planning an offensive that would finally break the Gustav Line. Operation Diadem would be the most ambitious Allied assault yet attempted in Italy. Simultaneous attacks across a 20-mile front by 4 corps totaling 15 divisions, more than 3.1 numerical superiority over German defenders. The plan integrated lessons from 4 months of failure. The artillery preparation would be unprecedented. 1,600 guns, British 25-pounders, American 155mm howitzers, 7.2-inch heavy howitzers mounted on American carriages, massed to deliver overwhelming fire. The 7.2-inch howitzer could fire 90-kilogram high-explosive shells at 520 meters per second, the kind of destructive power required to shatter fortified positions. Crucially, the assault wouldn't focus on Cassino itself. The French Expeditionary Corps would attack through the Monte Cassino mountains, outflanking the Gustav Line entirely. The British 13 Corps would push up the Liri Valley once the line was breached. The Polish 2 Corps would assault Monte Cassino directly, not because it was the key to victory, but because tying down German reserves there would prevent them from reinforcing against the French penetration. The tactical concept was sound: attack everywhere simultaneously, forcing Germans to commit reserves piecemeal, exploit wherever breakthrough occurred. But executing such coordination across multiple nations, diverse equipment, and difficult terrain required planning that occupied April entirely. For the Polish Corps, drawing the assignment to assault Monte Cassino was both honor and sentence. General Anders understood his troops would suffer catastrophic casualties. But he also understood that taking the monastery, even as a supporting attack, would demonstrate Polish valor to the world, provide a victory that might aid Poland's post-war negotiations. On May 11, 1944, at 2300 hours, 1,600 guns opened fire across the entire Gustav Line. The bombardment was different from previous attempts. Instead of random interdiction fire, every battery had specific targets determined by weeks of photo reconnaissance and artillery observers' reports. German command posts, ammunition dumps, artillery positions, communication centers, all were hit with pre-registered fire that didn't need adjustment to achieve accuracy. The noise was beyond anything participants had experienced. Continuous thunder of guns firing, shells passing overhead with freight train roars, impacts creating rolling barrages of explosions that walked across German positions with mechanical precision. German survivors described it as hell manifest. The earth shaking, air thick with dust and explosive fumes, communication wires severed, observation posts blinded. An hour after midnight on May 12th, the infantry advanced. The French struck in the mountains with 4 divisions abreast. the 2nd Moroccan, 3rd Algerian, 4th Moroccan Mountain Division, and 1st Motorized Division. They infiltrated through terrain the Germans had considered impassable, bypassing strong points, penetrating deep before defenders realized the threat. The British 13 Corps pushed into the Liri Valley, finally crossing the Rapido where the 36th Division had been slaughtered. But now German defences were weakened, reserves committed elsewhere, and British engineers bridged the river under covering fire before significant resistance developed. The Polish assault on Monte Cassino began at 0130 hours. The 3rd Carpathian Division attacked Phantom Ridge and Hill 593, the heights directly below the monastery. The 5th Crossover Division attacked Monte Castellone and Passo Corno to the north, attempting to encircle German positions. What the Poles encountered was hell. The artillery bombardment, despite its scale, had been largely ineffective against dug-in Fallschirmjäger positions. German bunkers built into rock survived direct hits. When Polish infantry emerged from assembly areas, they walked into pre-registered German artillery fire that killed dozens before they reached German lines. The slopes were impossibly steep. Troops climbed using hands and feet, carrying weapons and ammunition under fire from positions they couldn't see. German machine guns opened up at close range with devastating effect. The MG-42's 1,200 round per minute cyclic rate meant every burst could kill multiple men before they could take cover. German mortars dropped rounds with pinpoint accuracy on Polish assembly areas, guided by observers who knew every terrain feature. Captain Stefan Orzechowski of the 5th Crossover Division later recalled, "We advanced through machine gun fire so intense it seemed impossible anything could survive. Men fell at every step. We reached the German positions and discovered the artillery had done nothing. Bunkers intact, defenders ready. We fought hand-to-hand with grenades and bayonets." The Carpathian Division suffered even worse on Hill 593. The objective was full of German bunkers, concrete positions built into the reverse slope, invisible from below, with clear fields of fire across the crest. Polish troops reaching the crest were silhouetted against the sky, perfect targets for German gunners. By dawn on May 12th, half the attacking Polish force had been killed or wounded. Anders, watching from his command post, faced an agonizing decision: continue the assault or withdraw and accept failure. He ordered withdrawal, better to save lives than waste them in futile attacks. But the Polish assault had accomplished its mission. German commanders, convinced Cassino was the main attack, committed their reserves to stopping the Poles. When French troops broke through in the mountains and British forces established bridgeheads across the Rapido, German reserves needed to counter those threats were already engaged at Cassino. While Poles died on Monte Cassino's slopes, the real breakthrough was happening in the mountains to the south. French colonial troops, advancing through terrain Germans believed impassable, had penetrated 12 miles behind the Gustav Line by May 14th. The entire German defensive system was compromised. If French forces continued advancing, they'd cut Highway 6 behind Cassino, trapping German forces in a pocket. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, commanding German 1000 Panzer Corps, recognized the threat immediately. The Gustav Line was lost. Maintaining positions at Cassino would result in encirclement and destruction. On May 16th, he ordered withdrawal to the Hitler Line, the second prepared defensive position north of Cassino. The evacuation was masterful. Under cover of fierce defensive fighting, German units broke contact at night, moving north in organized columns. Fallschirmjäger units at Cassino held their positions until May 17th, buying time for the main force to escape. On the evening of May 17th, Polish troops renewed their assault. This time they found German positions significantly weakened. The Carpathian Division fought through remaining defenders on Hill 593, accepting heavy casualties but gaining ground. The 12th Podolian Lancers, reconnaissance troops, not assault infantry, pushed toward the monastery ruins. At dawn on May 18th, a patrol from the 12th Lancers reached the abbey ruins. They found approximately 30 wounded German soldiers and medical personnel. The rear guard left behind because they couldn't be evacuated. The Poles had no Polish flag prepared. They hadn't expected victory so soon. A makeshift regimental standard was raised over the ruins at 10:20 hours. An hour later, a proper Polish flag arrived, raised alongside the British Union Jack. 4 months of fighting for Monte Cassino had ended. The cost was staggering. 105,000 Allied casualties. Polish casualties alone exceeded 4,000. Nearly 1,000 dead, over 3,000 wounded, 345 missing. German casualties approached 20,000. But the Gustav Line was broken. Highway 6 to Rome was open. The Winter Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable barrier, had been penetrated by multinational determination, tactical evolution, and overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. Monte Cassino provided brutal education in modern warfare's realities, lessons applicable far beyond Italian mountains. First, fortified positions require combined arms to reduce. Artillery alone, even in overwhelming quantities, cannot destroy prepared defensive positions built into rock and earth. The bombardments at Cassino expended hundreds of thousands of shells, enough explosive power to level cities, yet Fallschirmjäger in bunkers survived to fight when infantry attacked. Effective reduction required integrating artillery, aviation, armor, and infantry. Artillery suppressed defenders, aviation struck rear areas, armor provided direct fire support. Infantry closed with and destroyed defensive positions. No single arm could succeed alone. Only coordination multiplied effectiveness. Second, terrain determines tactics more than doctrine. The same Allied armies that would execute sophisticated mechanized operations in France struggled in Italian mountains where armor couldn't operate, where infantry had to climb impossible slopes under fire, where supply and evacuation were nightmares of human endurance. Mountain warfare required specialized troops, equipment, and tactics. The French colonial troops succeeded because they understood mountain operations intuitively. Conventional infantry, trained for open terrain, had to relearn everything in mountains that negated their training. Third, attacking defended positions requires numerical superiority at the point of assault. Allied commanders eventually assembled 15 divisions, approximately 200,000 troops, to break through German defenses held by perhaps 60,000. That 3.1 superiority was barely adequate. Attackers suffered higher casualties than defenders throughout the campaign. Only by accepting catastrophic losses and attacking simultaneously across wide fronts did Allies achieve breakthrough. Fourth, logistics matter as much as tactics. The French breakthrough succeeded partly because Allied logistics could sustain multi-division offensives over terrible terrain. Ammunition consumption in modern warfare exceeds pre-war calculations by orders of magnitude. The artillery bombardment preceding Operation Diadem consumed more shells than many nations' entire stockpiles. Only America's industrial capacity could sustain such expenditure. Fifth, morale and motivation affect outcomes. Polish troops, fighting for national survival, accepted casualties that would have broken other units. French colonial troops, led by officers who understood and respected them, performed missions conventional units couldn't attempt. Indian Army soldiers, from martial traditions valuing honor and courage, fought with determination exceeding what conscript armies could sustain. Finally, fortifications buy time but don't guarantee victory. The Winter Line delayed Allied advance by 4 months. 4 months Germany used to fortify Gothic Line positions further north. 4 months that affected timing of operations across all theaters. But delay isn't victory. Eventually, numerical and material superiority overwhelmed even the best designed defenses, skillfully held by elite troops. Private Jim White survived the Rapido crossing, one of the few from his battalion who did. He spent the next year as a German prisoner of war, surviving camps where thousands died of disease, starvation, and abuse. When he returned home to Texas, people asked what he'd done in the war. He told them about the Rapido, the boats capsizing, friends drowning, the impossible mission that everyone knew was doomed. Most people didn't want to hear it. Americans wanted stories of victory, not catastrophic mistakes. The Polish veterans of Monte Cassino faced even worse homecomings. With Poland occupied by the Soviets, they couldn't return home without facing imprisonment or execution. Many settled in Britain, Italy, or America, exiles from a country that existed but was closed to them. Their victory at Monte Cassino, which should have been celebrated as Polish valor reborn, became a footnote as Cold War politics made their contribution inconvenient to acknowledge. Today, the Polish War Cemetery at Monte Cassino holds 1,052 graves, soldiers from the two corps who died in Italian campaigns. General Anders himself is buried there, having died in exile in London in 1970, never returning to the Poland he'd fought to free. The cemetery's memorial bears an inscription: "We Polish soldiers, for our freedom and yours, have given our souls to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland." The French colonial troops who broke through in the mountains returned to Algeria and Morocco, where their service would be forgotten or deliberately obscured during decolonization struggles. The contribution of North African soldiers to Allied victory became politically inconvenient to acknowledge. Only recently have historians properly recognized their crucial role. The Indian Army soldiers who fought at Cassino returned to an India moving toward independence and partition. The violence of 1947's partition overshadowed wartime service. The Gurkhas, Sikhs, Punjabis, and others who'd fought across multiple theaters became footnotes in narratives focused on political independence rather than military service. Even American veterans of the Rapido Crossing felt forgotten. The 36th Division's sacrifice was overshadowed by D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and Pacific campaigns. The congressional investigation cleared Clark of wrongdoing, but survivors knew the truth. They'd been ordered into impossible circumstances by commanders who valued ambition over soldiers' lives. The British and New Zealand troops, who'd fought through multiple failed assaults before Operation Diadem succeeded, found their efforts dismissed as preliminary failures rather than necessary steps toward eventual victory. Only the final successful assault was remembered, not the months of brutal fighting that made it possible. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, just 2 days before D-Day. The liberation of Italy's capital, which had driven so much Allied strategy, was immediately overshadowed by the Normandy invasion. Newsreels that should have covered Rome's liberation instead focused entirely on France. The Italian campaign, which would continue until May 1945, became the forgotten theatre, overshadowed by operations in France and Germany. Yet the tactical and technological lessons learned at Monte Cassino shaped operations across all theatres. The combined arms coordination perfected in Italian mountains became doctrine for France. The understanding that fortified positions required systematic reduction rather than frontal assault influenced planning for the Siegfried Line and Rhine crossings. The recognition that specialized troops could accomplish missions impossible for conventional forces led to expanded use of mountain, airborne, and commando units. The equipment lessons were equally important. The Sherman tank's vulnerability to German anti-tank guns demonstrated catastrophically in Cassino's rubble-choked streets, accelerated development of better armored variants. The recognition that strategic bombing couldn't destroy well-constructed fortifications influenced targeting decisions in subsequent campaigns. The importance of artillery in mountain warfare led to development of lighter, more mobile guns that could be positioned on terrain impossible to conventional artillery. The psychological lessons were harder to quantify, but equally significant. Commanders learned that morale couldn't be taken for granted, that soldiers required realistic understanding of missions rather than false optimism, that acknowledging previous failures improved planning for future operations. The Rapido disaster taught that sacrificing units in doomed attacks destroyed not just combat power, but trust between soldiers and commanders.
For the Germans, the Winter Line demonstrated that even the best defensive positions eventually fall when attackers possess overwhelming material superiority and willingness to accept casualties. The Fallschirmjäger,
who'd held Cassino against repeated assaults, eventually retreated because they were outflanked by French troops in mountains, not because they were defeated in direct assault. The lesson was sobering. No position is impregnable, no defense unbreakable when enemies can concentrate force at unexpected points. Today, Monte Cassino has been completely rebuilt. The monastery, destroyed in 1944's bombing, was reconstructed stone by stone using the original plans. It reopened in 1956, returning to its role as centre of Benedictine learning and spirituality. Standing in its courtyards, you'd never know it had been obliterated by Allied bombs and fought over in desperate close combat. But the mountains remember. Walking the slopes where Polish troops attacked, you can still find shell fragments, bullet casings, pieces of equipment weathered by decades. The terrain itself explains why the battle was so brutal. Slopes too steep for mechanized support, observation from heights giving defenders overwhelming advantage, approaches channeled into killing zones. The Polish cemetery is immaculately maintained, funded by Polish diaspora communities worldwide. On May 18th each year, the anniversary of the monastery's capture, ceremonies commemorate Polish sacrifice. Veterans attended until recently. The last survivors have now passed, taking living memory with them. The Rapido River still flows where Texas soldiers drowned in 1944. The banks where engineers tried to build bridges under fire are peaceful now. Farmland returned to agricultural use. Nothing marks the crossing sites. No monuments commemorate the 36th Division's sacrifice. Local farmers occasionally unearth artifacts, helmets, entrenching tools, dog tags, reminders of what happened in their fields 8 decades ago. The town of Cassino was completely rebuilt after the war. The rubble that made it an impregnable fortress was cleared, streets realigned, buildings reconstructed. Only photos show what it became during the battle. Every building a strong point, every street a kill zone, every basement a bunker. The Continental Hotel, rebuilt as a modern structure, bears a plaque noting its role as German defensive headquarters. Castle Hill and Hangman's Hill, where Indian troops died trying to reach the heights, overlook the rebuilt town. The bunkers and fighting positions have largely weathered away, though concrete foundations remain for those who know where to look. The view explains everything. From those heights, every movement in the valley below is visible, every approach covered by fire. The numbers are overwhelming but abstract. 105,000 Allied casualties over 4 months. Behind each statistic was a person, someone's son, husband, father, brother, friend. Private Jim White returned to Texas, worked as a mechanic, raised a family, and tried not to think about friends who drowned in the Rapido. He attended 36th Division reunions where survivors shared memories they couldn't discuss with anyone else. He died in 1994, having finally spoken publicly about the Rapido in interviews for historians who were documenting the campaign. Lieutenant Stefan Orzechowski, who led Polish troops up Phantom Ridge, settled in Britain after the war. He worked as an engineer, never returning to a Poland controlled by the Soviets. He attended Monte Cassino ceremonies annually, wearing his medals, saluting fallen comrades. In a 1984 interview, 40 years after the battle, he described it simply. "We did what was necessary. Poland needed the world to see that Poles could fight, could win, still mattered. The price was terrible, but what choice did we have?" Captain Pierre Mesmer, who fought with French colonial troops in the mountain breakthrough, returned to North Africa after the war and eventually became Prime Minister of France. He spent his political career advocating for recognition of colonial soldiers' contributions, a battle he largely lost, as France preferred narratives that minimized colonial involvement in liberation. Before his death in 2007, he established foundations ensuring North African veterans received proper pensions and recognition. Havildar Gage Gale of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, was awarded the Victoria Cross for actions on May 26-27, 1944, in operations following Monte Cassino's fall. He single-handedly destroyed 2 German machine gun positions and a mortar position while wounded, enabling his company to advance. He survived the war, returned to Nepal, and died in 2000 at Mindar, one of the last surviving Gurkha vicees. His citation noted that his actions inspired all who witnessed them, the characteristic understatement of military awards for extraordinary heroism. Oberleutnant Gerhard Delefont, who commanded a Fallschirmjäger company defending Cassino, was captured when German forces withdrew. He spent 4 years as a British prisoner, returned to Germany in 1949, and worked as a teacher. In interviews in the 1970s, he spoke respectfully of Allied soldiers he'd fought against. They kept attacking, knowing they would suffer terrible casualties because their duty required it. That courage demands respect, even from enemies. These individual stories, multiplied thousands of times, constitute the human reality behind strategic narratives about breaking the winter line. Each casualty figure represents someone who experienced fear, pain, courage, friendship, loss, someone whose life was shaped or ended by decisions made at command levels far removed from the mountains where consequences played out. Military historians continued debating whether the Italian campaign, and specifically the battles for Monte Cassino, was strategically justified or a wasteful diversion from more important theatres. The critics argue that Allied forces committed to Italy could have been better used elsewhere. The 15 divisions fighting at Cassino could have accelerated the Normandy invasion, opened a second front in southern France earlier, or reinforced Pacific operations. The resources consumed, ammunition, fuel, equipment, shipping, represented opportunity costs that affected operations worldwide. The 4-month delay in breaking the winter line, critics note, achieved limited strategic results. Rome's capture had minimal military significance. It was a political and propaganda objective, not a strategic necessity. The Germans successfully withdrew north of Rome, established new defensive lines, and continued fighting in Italy until May 1945. The campaign consumed resources while achieving operational stalemate. The defenders of the Italian strategy counter that the campaign tied down German divisions that would have reinforced France, Russia, or the Balkans. The 20-plus German divisions fighting in Italy couldn't defend against D-Day or Soviet offensives. Kesselring's forces included some of Germany's best troops, Fallschirmjäger, Panzer Grenadier divisions, experienced commanders who were unavailable for more critical fronts. Additionally, the campaign provided invaluable experience in combined arms operations, amphibious assaults, mountain warfare, and reduction of fortified positions. The lessons learned in Italy directly influenced planning for subsequent operations. The Normandy invasion benefited from Italian campaign experience in beach assaults, logistics, and combined arms coordination. The strategic debate remains unresolved because it requires counterfactual reasoning. What would have happened if those resources had been used differently? We know what occurred historically. We can only speculate about alternatives. What's indisputable is that soldiers who fought at Monte Cassino believed their sacrifices mattered, that the campaign served larger purposes, that their victories contributed to eventual Allied success. Monte Cassino marked an inflection point in several military technologies and tactics that would shape warfare's future evolution. The tactical use of strategic bombers demonstrated both promise and limitations. The massive bombardments of February and March 1944 showed that heavy bombers could deliver unprecedented destructive power against surface targets. But they also proved that bombing alone couldn't reduce fortified positions defended by troops in deep bunkers. This lesson influenced targeting decisions throughout the rest of the war. Strategic bombing focused increasingly on industrial targets, transportation networks, and area attacks, rather than tactical support of ground operations. The development of artillery tactics at Cassino represented significant evolution. The massed fires supporting Operation Diadem, 1,600 guns firing coordinated missions, demonstrated capabilities far beyond what any previous generation had achieved. The use of pre-registered targets, timed barrages, and counter-battery fire became standard doctrine. Artillery pieces like the British 25-pounder and American 155mm howitzer
proved their value in mountain warfare, where their range and accuracy were essential. Armor tactics evolved through painful experience. The Sherman tank's vulnerabilities, thin side armor, high profile, tendency to burn when penetrated, were brutally exposed in Cassino street fighting. But the campaign also demonstrated armor's value when properly employed, as mobile firepower supporting infantry, as breakthrough force when defensive positions cracked, as exploitation force when pursuit became possible. The lessons influenced tank design and employment doctrine for the rest of the war. Infantry weapons and tactics showed surprising continuity. The M1 Garand rifle, which gave American infantry significant firepower advantage over German bolt-action rifles, proved its worth in close combat. The Thompson submachine gun remained ideal for house-to-house fighting, where ranges were short and volume of fire mattered more than accuracy. German MG-42 machine guns dominated defensive positions, forcing attackers to develop new suppression and assault tactics. Communications technology proved both essential and inadequate. Radio communications allowed coordination of complex multi-unit operations, but unreliable equipment and mountainous terrain created frequent failures. Forward observers directing artillery fire needed clear communications with gun batteries. When radios failed, entire attacks foundered. The campaign accelerated development of more reliable radios and backup communication systems. Medical evacuation evolved significantly. The difficulties of evacuating wounded from mountain slopes under fire led to development of improved stretcher systems, evacuation routes, and forward medical facilities. The acceptance of significant blood loss during evacuation changed medical protocols. Penicillin, newly available, reduced infection mortality dramatically. These innovations saved thousands of lives throughout the remainder of the war. The Monte Cassino campaign's aftermath was shaped profoundly by Cold War politics that began even before Germany's surrender. The Polish II Corps, having liberated Monte Cassino, found their homeland liberated by Soviet forces who installed a communist government. Most Polish soldiers couldn't return home without facing imprisonment or worse. Britain established the Polish Resettlement Corps to help Polish servicemen settle in Britain or emigrate elsewhere. Over 100,000 Polish soldiers chose exile over return to communist-controlled Poland. This created historical anomaly. Polish veterans who'd fought courageously for Allied victory, who'd taken objective after objective at terrible cost, were effectively stateless persons in the post-war world. Their contribution to Allied victory was acknowledged officially, but politically inconvenient. The Soviet Union, now an ally, objected to celebrating anti-communist Poles' achievements. Western governments, hoping to maintain détente with Stalin, soft-pedaled Polish military contributions. The French colonial troops faced similar historical erasure. As France struggled with decolonization in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia in the 1950s-60s, acknowledging North African soldiers' crucial role in France's liberation became politically difficult. Post-colonial narratives in North Africa emphasized resistance to French rule rather than cooperation in defeating Germany. The Goumiers and Tirailleurs who'd broken the Winter Line became uncomfortable reminders of complex colonial relationships. The Indian Army's contribution disappeared into partition's violence and independent India's post-colonial narrative. The new Indian government emphasized Gandhi's non-violent resistance to British rule, not Indian soldiers' service in British-commanded armies. The Gurkhas, Sikhs, and others who'd fought at Cassino were relegated to footnotes, their service dismissed as colonial collaboration rather than recognized as military valor. Only decades after the Cold War's end has honest historical assessment become possible. The 1989 fall of communist regimes allowed Polish veterans' contributions to be properly acknowledged in Poland. The opening of Soviet archives revealed the extent to which political considerations had shaped official histories. Recent scholarship has restored appropriate recognition to multinational forces whose contributions were minimized for political convenience. 79 years after Polish troops raised their flag over Monte Cassino's ruins, the battle's lessons remain relevant to anyone studying military operations, strategy, or the human dimensions of warfare. The technical lessons about combined arms warfare, artillery employment, and reduction of fortified positions are studied at staff colleges worldwide. The campaign demonstrates principles that transcend specific weapons or tactics. Principles about coordination, concentration of force, exploitation of success, and adaptation to unexpected challenges. The strategic lessons about the relationship between tactical operations and strategic objectives remain debated. When do tactical victories justify costs? How does one measure success when operations achieve objectives but at catastrophic expense? What are the opportunity costs of committing forces to secondary theatres? These questions, relevant at Monte Cassino, remain relevant in every military campaign. The human lessons are perhaps most important and most easily forgotten. Soldiers will endure extraordinary hardship and danger when they believe their cause is just and their leaders are competent. But trust, once broken by incompetent command or wasteful tactics, is nearly impossible to restore. The men who died crossing the Rapido, climbing Phantom Ridge, or assaulting Cassino's rubble-choked streets deserved leadership worthy of their courage. The multinational character of the campaign offers lessons about coalition warfare that remain crucial in today's alliance-based security systems. Different national armies brought different capabilities, motivations, and limitations. Effective coalition command required understanding and leveraging those differences rather than imposing uniformity. The French mountain tactics, Polish determination, Indian military traditions, and British organizational capabilities were all essential to eventual success. Finally, the battle reminds us that warfare's human cost can never be reduced to statistics or abstracted into strategic calculation. Behind every casualty figure is a person whose life had value beyond their role in military operations. The 105,000 Allied casualties at Monte Cassino represented 105,000 individual tragedies, deaths, wounds, trauma, grief inflicted on families and communities. Private Jim White, struggling across the Rapido River under machine gun fire, carrying mortar equipment he'd never use, watching friends drown, his experience can't be reduced to tactical analysis of river crossing failures. Lieutenant Orzechowski, leading Polish troops up impossible slopes toward German bunkers, knowing many would die but accepting necessity. His courage transcends operational summaries. These were the forgotten heroes of Monte Cassino, ordinary soldiers from multiple nations, speaking different languages, carrying different equipment, but united in facing extraordinary challenges with determination that military professionals still study in awe. The monastery stands rebuilt, peaceful, returned to its spiritual purpose. The mountains remain indifferent to human struggles fought across their slopes. The Polish cemetery is maintained with quiet dignity, reminding visitors of sacrifices made by men far from home, fighting for principles larger than themselves. And somewhere in Texas, a quiet monument marks the 36th Division's sacrifice, not at the Rapido, but in a small park where veterans gather each January 20th, fewer each year, to remember friends who didn't come home, to testify that their deaths weren't meaningless, to ensure someone remembers the terrible price of breaking the winter line. The frozen hell of Monte Cassino has passed into history, but its lessons endure, carved into mountains that witness courage, inscribed in cemeteries where heroes rest, preserved in memories of survivors who ensured their generation's sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten.